so excited that we have Elsa Soderstrom and Dr. Jeff Munroe with us here today. Elsa is a senior at Middlebury College in Vermont. She has a double major or a joint major in environmental studies and geology, and she's minoring in global health. She's a Minnesota native with a strong Ely connection. She's got a family cabin up here, and I know personally that her family is very engaged in the Ely community. And Dr. Jeff Munroe is the Philip Battle Stewart and Sarah Frances Coles Stewart Professor of Geology at Middlebury College in Vermont. And we are very excited to hear from them today about the research they've undertaken. I confess I'm not going to try to explain it because I'm so eager to hear from them all about it. I don't want to botch it. So Elsa and Jeff, please take it away at your leisure.
Thank you, Lacey. Can everyone hear me all right? Good. Well, this is really a pleasure to have a chance to present alongside Elsa in your Tuesday group. When Elsa and I were together in Utah last fall doing field work for this project, I think that was when she first told me about the possibility of doing this. And of course I said, yes, sounds like something that would be a lot of fun. So here we are, March 8th, came up awful fast, but Elsa and I have a story to tell you guys today. And we look forward to hearing the questions that you might have for us in the chat at the end. So we kind of flipped a coin, I guess, and I'm going to go first, and then I'm going to pass things over to Elsa a little bit later on. Speaking of technology, I'm going to attempt to share my screen without losing sight of all of your faces. Yeah, there we go. And with a little bit of luck, we'll be ready to go. Thumbs up. You see my screen, looks good. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so yeah, I'm here in Middlebury, Vermont, which is a long way from Ely, although I'll say at the outset that I do know a little bit about your charming neck of the woods. I lived in Wisconsin for years. I spent every free moment, it seemed, somewhere up around Lake Superior, skiing or hiking or canoeing or some combination of those, and always really enjoyed exploring that part of the world. And so it's a real treat to have a chance to talk to some folks who are riding out the latter part of winter in the North Woods right now. But we're not going to talk about Vermont today, nor are we going to talk about Ely or Minnesota at all. We're going to talk about mountains in the southwestern US and what the deposition of dust is doing to the ecology and the functioning of those mountains. So our title, Dust in the Wind, we're going to talk about modern dust in mountains of the Southwest with a beautiful, beautiful picture here to kind of kick things off. So if the thought of spending part of your Tuesday lunch hearing about dust seems a bit strange, I'll try to impress upon you right at the outset with this animation, which is a set of observations made from satellites showing all kinds of things in motion through the Earth's atmosphere. It's kind of a time-lapse loop. It's from 2006, which is irrelevant really for the point I'm trying to make. I just want you to see how much of this orange-brown stuff there is. This is all dust. This is all mineral material. It's eroding off of the ground, yeah, in the Sahara Desert, for instance, but in other places around the world, and getting transported through the atmosphere and then landing back on the ground somewhere else. So that simple process is a loss of minerals, a loss of nutrients, a loss of something from the ecosystem in one place, and then the deposition of those nutrients and those minerals to the ecosystem someplace else, often with really, really profound consequences. And I like this animation because it shows just how prevalent this process is, even if it's something that we haven't perhaps thought much about before. The Sahara is a big emitter of dust, as is the Middle East. That's not a huge surprise, probably. But look at all the orange coming out of the deserts in parts of Central Asia, parts of the Australian outback, southern parts of South America, eastern side of the Andes here in South America. And indeed, once you know exactly what you're looking for, you can see there's a fair amount of this stuff moving around in the southwestern US as well. So that's where we're going for this project. And I joked to Elsa that after I had clipped this image from Google, I realized I had made a terrible mistake of leaving Ely off of it entirely. So I'll throw that up there for you guys. We're going to look at the southwestern US, and we're going to talk about mountain ranges or mountain environments that are downwind from locations where dust can be produced. So the Rocky Mountains, sure, as well as what I will call other mountains, which are all of these other somewhat isolated and much less familiar mountain ranges in southern Utah, in parts of Nevada, in places over toward Northern California. they are all unified in the sense that they are not far downwind of places that have arid landscapes without a lot of vegetation, windy climates, places where dust is going to be produced, like the Colorado Plateau. Think of the landscape around the Four Corners or around the Grand Canyon, if you have had the chance to go there. The Mojave Desert around, for instance, Las Vegas or southern parts of California. Or if you've ever driven across Nevada or flown over it, the whole place is pretty much one big dust emitting landscape because there were lots of lakes there in the past that dried up and left behind all of this fine sediment that's vulnerable to being blown away by the wind. So my work on dust in this region started in this particular mountain range, the Uinta Mountains, which are in northeastern parts of Utah. Salt Lake City would be right about there. This thing there is the Great Salt Lake. This is the border of Utah and Wyoming. So that's the area that we're looking at for the start of this project, just to kind of set the stage. And these are interesting looking mountains. When you get up on top of the Uintas, they're flat on top. They're really, really high, 12,000, 13,000 feet high, but they're flat on top. And what's important is that this landscape was not touched by glaciers. It was too high, basically. The glaciers were off on either side of this ridge here, but they weren't present on the top. So as a result, this landscape's really old. It's been sitting there for possibly millions of years, collecting dust, which is landing on it. So even if the amount of dust year by year is small, the cumulative effect of that dust over time could be pretty substantial. So again, the landscape where you are in Ely had a glacier on it 10,000 years ago. This landscape is many, many times older and has received dust, therefore, for an awful long time, long enough to matter. It turns out you can see the effects of this if, for instance, you go up on top of the Uintas on this alpine landscape and dig a soil pit, which I've done many times in work that I've done with the US Forest Service. Everywhere you go, you find a situation like this. You find that the soil has kind of two parts. The deep part, which is really obviously produced by just cracking of the local bedrock. It's sandy and stony. And on top of that is this really different stuff, which is really fine grained, really high in nutrients. And this is all dust. So the upper part of the soil even is pure dust. You wouldn't have the soil here if it weren't for this dust accumulating over time. So dust is fundamentally a parent material for the soil, which is important to remember. Similarly, if you look at this landscape in the summer, it's beautiful, just alpine wildflowers as far as you can see, which implies that there's a high amount of fertility in the soil. The local bedrock here doesn't have really anything in it that would serve as a necessary nutrients for plants. They've got to be coming from someplace else. So this is a situation where the dust is serendipitously acting as the source of nutrients and fertilizing these soils, making it appropriate not just for beautiful blooms of flowers, but really for the entire ecosystem to function as we see it today, because things live on those flowers, right? That's food for the plants that live out there. If you want to think about it from a hydrology perspective, well, the water in the streams and the water in the lakes in this landscape has a pH. It's pretty neutral. It's not really acidic. It's not really basic, even though the precipitation that's falling in the form of rain and snow is really fairly acidic, as is the case in most places. So it looks as though dust is actually acting conveniently to neutralize some of that acidity in the precipitation, making these streams and these lakes more suitable for different types of aquatic life. And finally, something which has gotten a lot of attention recently is that the simple act of depositing dust on top of snow makes it less white. It makes it darker. And darker snow absorbs more sunlight, it warms up faster, and it melts faster in the spring. So the fact that these snowbanks, like the one in this picture here, are visibly darkened by even trace amounts of dust means that the entire hydrology of this environment is changing. The snow is melting sooner in the springtime. It's not lasting as long into the summertime, which means streams are flooding earlier in the year and then they're drying up at the end of the summer. Big changes downstream. So way back in 2011, I can't believe how long ago this was now, I started looking at dust kind of head on in this area with the idea that if I wanted to figure out what kind of effect dust was having on this environment, I first needed to collect some. I needed to figure out a way to collect modern dust so I could evaluate what its properties were, figure out how much of it there was, figure out where it's coming from. And so in the picture here, you can see one of my dust collectors. They are plexiglass trays filled with glass marbles. They're really not all that fancy. Various people in various locations around the world have used aspects of this design in their own efforts to collect dust because it works. The glass marbles are like gravel. They're kind of a rough surface that disturbs the flow of the wind over the ground and allows the dust to settle out. And the dust kind of works its way down underneath the gravel and is protected there from blowing away and landing somewhere else. Glass is easy to use because you can clean it. Gravel's pretty dirty in comparison. I use black marble so they heat up in the sun and evaporate out any of the rainwater to keep the dust dry and keep the collector from overflowing. But the basic design's pretty simple. And although it was experimental at first, I'm happy to say that after all these years, I can confirm that it actually works quite well. The first 4 of these I put out in 2011, and I put 4 more of them out in 2015 when I was able to get a little bit more funding to expand the project. And those are still there, but they have been joined by a few other things over the years. One of them is something fancier, more complicated. As I'll show you later, that's not always a good thing. Something I call an active sampler. We put up this out in 2013. This is a solar powered device that uses little motors and little fans to actually sample out the dust when the air is coming or when the wind is coming from the north and keep that separate from the dust that's delivered by wind coming from the south. So we can start to figure out whether direction really matters here or not. On the left side here are the actual samplers, one that sucks in air from the north, one that sucks in air from the south. Here's the power, here's the batteries, and there's a little wind activated switch on the right side, which turns the different fans on and off depending on which way the wind is blowing. The original set of all of these collectors, here's the state of Utah, again, there's Salt Lake City, and here's the Uinta Mountains, and there were 8 of them over here, including the active sampler, which was located right next to one of the marble samplers. And yeah, those are still there and they're still working. Elsa did not have a chance to go to any of those with me, but as far as I know, they're still there. They were after Elsa visited. What's changed most recently is that in 2020, I and several colleagues expanded this project massively when we received funding for this new collaborative effort that we call Dust Squared, which is our clever acronym for Dust Across a Desert Urban Summit Transect. Previous work on dusts, the work of myself included, tended to focus on just one part of the system. I would look at dust, for instance, when it fell on the ground, it was incorporated into the soil, period. Or maybe people would look just at dust and what it does to the transmittance of water in a hydrologic system or something like that. Dust Squared is designed intentionally to look at the whole thing. And so we have people as part of the team for Dust Squared that study the dust emitting landscapes out in the desert. We have people that study the dust transport in the atmosphere. We have people that study the mixing of natural dust and urban dust, the dust which is produced in cities from cars and combustion and construction and human activity in general. We have people that are looking at dust specifically on snow as it lands back on the ground, people that are looking at dust as a source of nutrients in alpine ecosystems, and my own little piece looking at dust as a component of mountain soils. So this Dust Squared project, which started again just a little more than a year ago, is the logical extension of that work that I began with my little trays of beads and glass marbles in the mountains 10 years ago. Dust Squared involved a pretty major expansion of the footprint of the project too. So in black are my original 8 collectors in northern Utah, and now these pink triangles represent all of the other collectors which I have put out, some of which Elsa will talk about a little bit later, that are part of Dust Squared. So there's 18 of them now, which officially means I have I'm bordering on having bitten off more than I can chew. Going to all of these is quite an experience, although as you'll see, it's not bad work if you can get it. It's pretty nice, even if it takes some time. These things are in some pretty remote and yet spectacular locations because almost all of them are on US Forest Service land. The Forest Service was kind enough to provide permission for the project, but they said, don't put them anywhere where people are going to find them. That was something that they were particularly concerned about. So I said, okay, I can do that. And I've endeavored to put them in locations that are appropriate for the study and yet also, remote enough that no one's bound to kind of stumble across them. And this one here, for instance, that we're sitting next to in this video no one's going to find that. Well, I shouldn't say no one, but it hasn't happened yet. I find it kind of unlikely that anyone's going to see that one anytime soon. And just to give you an idea of the array or the range of different locations, some of them are a little bit less spectacular. Here's one, for instance, which is in the Snowbird ski area east of Salt Lake City, if anyone has been out there to ski before. And it's up on an instrument tower where they're co-located a bunch of devices for measuring snow and meteorology. So it's a good place to put a dust collector. Or this one, which is not super glamorous, but is on the roof of the science building at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, next to a competing design, which I'm happy to say mine is better. So head-to-head competition here. Or some remote ones. Here's one in southeastern Utah, not far from Canyonlands and Arches National Park, for instance, or one kind of almost on a lunar landscape here in a mountain range in southwestern Utah that no one's ever heard of, but is beautiful, as Elsa will show you. How do they get there? This is the question everyone always asks me, and the simple answer is I carry them up there. And if I'm lucky, I got a student to help, but many of these I was by myself. So you strap the dust collector onto your backpack, you fill the backpack up with 15 pounds of the glass beads. You realize you're not young anymore, but you just grin and bear it because it's good work if you can get it. And you climb up there and you deploy the dust collector. You find a nice flat spot where it doesn't look like it's going to be disturbed. You fill it with beads and you leave it there. You come back later. It's not particularly fancy, but it absolutely gets the job done. And by later, I mean that I go to these things twice a year. Try to get to them in early summer to collect the dust or to empty the dust which accumulated during the winter. And I go to them again as late as possible in the fall. So like early October, try to get them right before the snow comes in. And that represents the material which accumulated during the summer. So it's 2 collections per year, one that kind of spans 9 months and one that kind of spans 3 months, because in a mountain environment like this, that's pretty much your seasons. Emptying them is elegantly simple. You bring up 5 quarts of distilled water in these bottles. You bring a funnel, you bring a strainer, and you bring, I kid you not, a toothbrush and a turkey baster. The beads are all dirty. You take a look at that and you say, good job, I got a bunch of dust here to work with. You scoop out, or the students scoop out all the beads into the strainer, which on a day like this is lovely work. On a day like this is less lovely work, but in the interest of full disclosure, you can't have one without the other. Sometimes, if it's rained recently, the collector's got a lot of murky looking water floating around in it. That's when you use the turkey baster to suck that stuff out, because that's something you want to make sure you collect. You then, when the tray is empty of beads, you unscrew these little doors off of the end of it so you can tilt the whole thing up on end, and you can scrub it out with a toothbrush. You can see this tray here is still pretty dirty. This one's looking spotless. And then you pour some more distilled water down through that to rinse out all the stuff that you just loosened up with the toothbrush. And yeah, when you're done, you got 5 quarts of dirty water that you could bring back to the laboratory, and you can separate out the dust from the water and subject it to all types of analyses, which is part of what Elsa is involved in her research project this year. It takes about 45 minutes to empty one of these things, at least when you're starting out. You get a little bit faster when everyone knows what they're doing, but here's a time lapse to kind of show you how quickly you can do it when your drone is in the air and it only has a 20-minute battery. So empty out all of the individual troughs, tilt it up on end, scrape, 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 pour water through it. And while the drone squeals that its battery is ending, you put the whole thing back together and the video ends just like that. And I managed to save the drone too. But that's the process in hyperlapse to kind of give you an idea what it looks like. Now, some of you are probably saying this sounds good, too good to be true, and others are probably saying, how do I sign up? This sounds wonderful. It wouldn't be a fully honest presentation if I didn't show you a few aspects of this that don't always go according to plan. It is wonderful work on a day like this, when you're sitting there basking in the sun, in a cushion of alpine flowers, and you think this is the best. Or you can have days like this, which looks nice because it's sunny when you're taking the picture, but over your shoulder in the background, the sky doesn't look like it's going to be nice or very long. And in the mountains, yeah, the afternoon thunderstorms are the real thing. So starting early tends to be a good idea. Or days like this, I don't need to tell an audience in Ely that if I'm dressed like this, it's probably not warm. You know, some of these days up high, 12,000 feet in the mountains in October, it's really cold. Sometimes it's cold enough you got to bring the stove along so you can heat up the water because everything's frozen solid. Your collector might look like this. The dust is in there and all that ice and snow. You got to get it out by heating the water first. Or sometimes it just looks like this. And you can look at the landscape and you're like, where's the collector? I'll give you a hint, it's right there. But you got to find it if you want to try to empty it. So sometimes it's easier said than done. The nightmare scenario is the collector's not there anymore. I'll admit twice in all the years this has happened. Here's a spot where the collector was clearly there the last time I was there. When I came back, there was just 15 pounds of glass beads on the ground and a broken piece of plexiglass here. I'll never know what happened to it, but that's a shame. Fortunately, this is really, really rare, but yeah, it does happen. And don't get me started on this one. The active sampler, the one that I joked was maybe too complicated for its own good. You want to build something like this and install it at 12,500 feet in the mountains, you know it's not going to work perfectly. This is the highest continuously operated remote weather station in the United States. The weather out there is not very nice, as you might imagine. You can see in the background, it's coming in again. We've had electrical issues with this, which have required numerous rounds of high altitude electrical rewiring, which is always fun. I've had solar panels rip off of this in 100-mile-an-hour winds and land Lord knows where. I've had the weather vane kind of rip off, leaving behind this little fang of sheet metal, which I think has happened multiple times when the whole thing gets encased in a little bit too much ice in the winter, and then it's just more than it can bear. That's always a bit tricky because you don't want to make that weather vane too heavy or the wind won't be able to move it and turn the fans on and off. This past fall, my solution was to rebuild it out of an old license plate. So stay tuned. Elsa can inform you next year whether that strategy worked better than the metal flashing that I had previously used. It's working great the last time I was up there. But it all does work. It's just amazing. This is looking down, for instance, inside one of the tubes from that active sampler. It's full of dirt, right? And you get all that out and you could say this dust in this bottle here all came, in this case, from the south. You can analyze it and figure out something about its properties and what it's doing in that environment. So when things work well, trust me, it's awesome. And when they don't, well, in general, it's working well enough to focus on the good stuff. Real quick, some results then, and then I'll hand it over to Elsa. This is what we would call a bubble plot. So it's a map, and each of the locations of those 18 collectors is shown by a circle, and the size of the circle simply corresponds to how much dust is accumulating at that location in the summer of 2021 is this figure. And here's your scale if you're curious. I just throw it up here so you can see that it doesn't accumulate at the same rate all over the place. Some places don't receive much at all, just a couple of milligrams per square meter per day. Other places, like my original ones in northern Utah, are maybe 10 times that. Some places close to Salt Lake are 100 times that. And it's really kind of variable, which is quite interesting to see. Maybe that doesn't seem like a lot. Milligrams aren't big, right? But if you consider just the Uintas here, and consider the area of that mountain range and the average dust flux, we're getting about 700 tons of dust landing on this landscape every year. And yeah, it's a big landscape, but 700 tons is a lot of dust, right? And that's pretty much the average year in and year out. 7,000 tons has accumulated since I put my first collectors out 10 years ago. To me, that's kind of remarkable. Where's it coming from? Everybody wants to know, myself included. We can get at this a couple of different ways. All the modelers that are involved in this project that can use really sophisticated atmospheric models can make what they call a dust footprint map, like this one. I gave them a location of dust collector number 3, which is right there. And they ran their model and they figured out all of the different places in the landscape in the Western US that air passed over before it passed over dust 3. All right, and they used a 2-day window. So the colors here simply represent where was the air 2 days before it got to this location at any particular point. I think they did 3-hour intervals all summer long, which is kind of amazing. And on the one hand, you could look at this and say, well, Jeff, that's not all that surprising. That air looks like it covered almost all of Utah, almost all of Nevada. On the other hand, there's a lot of detail here, right? We're not getting anything from Oregon. We're not getting much from over here. We're not getting much from right there, or very, very little from Wyoming, despite its proximity and so on. Most of it seems like it's not coming from very far away at all. That's an interesting clue. Or we can look at the geochemistry of the dust. There's way too much on this figure for you here, but the stars of my original Uinta collectors, The X's mark locations where the geochemistry has been measured and it doesn't match with the Uintas. So we could say, yeah, we don't seem to get dust from up here. We don't seem to get dust from here. The other symbols are places where the match is good for various types of geochemical fingerprints. So yeah, this area north of Las Vegas in southern Nevada, which is also kind of a hotspot over here, it has the same geochemistry as what we see landing up here. So maybe that's one of the hotspots where the dust is coming from. Stay tuned. We're still working on that for sure. And my final piece, everyone wants to know, hey, these collectors are on the ground in the mountains. Doesn't that matter? Aren't they covered in snow? And I would say it matters, but not in the way that you might think, actually. Here's a quick graph that shows you how many days the collector was underneath the snow. And notice some of these are underneath the snow for like 200 days. Long winter up there. And this is simply the rate of dust accumulation. And it's a positive relationship. The longer they're underneath the snow, the more dust they accumulate, not the less dust. And I think it's because the snow itself is a really great dust collector. And when that snow melts, it sounds too good to be true, but I think a lot of the dust in the snow ends up in the collector on the ground anyway. So yeah, they're covered in snow, but I don't lose sleep over it because I actually think that's a good thing for the design of this project. The other thing that's great about this project is that I don't go out there alone all the time. Going all the way back 10 years ago, I've had so many great students that have been able to join me in the field and in the laboratory to try to make sense of all this, try to keep the collectors running. And it was a real pleasure to have Elsa Soderstrom join me for, was it just 5 days? We covered a lot of ground in October last week. This was the fall break here at the college. I was still in the field doing my work in Utah. And Elsa said, sure, I could do any number of things in fall break, but I will come to Utah and we will get dust together. So I want to hear now from Elsa, and I know you guys do too, but what it was like from a student's perspective to go out and join this kind of long running project and bite off a piece of it to be your senior thesis for the year. So Elsa, I'll mute, but I'll advance the slides for you, okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeff. Can everyone hear me okay? Is it working? Yeah, good. Okay, well, yeah, could you switch, Jeff, to the next slide? The great part about what I'm doing is that Jeff is tackling about a million things at once, and I get to kind of focus on one thing in particular, which is both exciting and a little bit more manageable for someone doing this for 1 year rather than life's research. So as Jeff was just talking about, with his NSF grant from 2019, he was able to put these new colorful dust collectors out. And so basically what I am doing is taking a look at his historical data from the Uinta Mountains and comparing them to these new dust collectors that form kind of a big arc in that region. So basically it's zooming out. There's a lot of information from that one region in the Uintas, and then this is the first year that analysis is occurring for these broader locations. So my hypothesis with this is, in analyzing the geochemical and mineralogical components and properties of the dust from these locations, I think that I'm going to see that local sources are important, basically saying that each of these will have distinct research or distinct data coming out of them because they are placed in different parts within this region. And who knows, we're getting some results back, and I'll show a little bit of that at the end, but it could be that they're all actually pretty similar, showing that, within these ranges of hundreds of miles, it might not actually make a huge difference where the dust is coming from, because it's actually coming from thousands of miles away. And this is like a drop in the bucket, these distances. Or it could show that, yeah, the bedrock that these are on is actually having a huge input to what we're seeing in the dust in that area. So when I flew in Salt Lake City to meet Jeff in October, he picked me up and we drove that first day down to the La Salle Mountains. And it was beautiful. Fall is my favorite season, and I was pleasantly surprised about the aspen trees. Jeff always rents a large truck, which is necessary because there's so much equipment. And so it's kind of funny, the truck was a staple in a lot of the pictures. It also got very muddy. But that first night, it was quite cold. I was coming from Middlebury, that was still in the 70s. Is odd. It's so warm in late October, and he had told me to bring my layers. And And I did, but I was still a little surprised that first night. It was like sleeting and snowing and just a little bit frigid. We were up in more of an alpine region. But there's my tent down at the bottom, and Jeff is an amazing trail cook. He's got some of his favorite recipes. So it was fun to not have to make them normally when I'm camping up in Ely, especially. It's me cooking, so I felt a little spoiled. But that next morning, it was pretty beautiful. You can switch, Jeff, to the next one. Yeah, we had blue skies. The trees were magnificent, and we started hiking. And if you switch again, pretty soon we got up to the saddle, and it kind of changed environments. For any of you who are bikers, this first section of this trail was on the whole enchilada mountain biking trail. So that's kind of fun. That's where the beginning of it is, I think. And then we took a right and went up toward the local high point there. And it was pretty snowy. It was kind of fun to see. I hadn't seen snow yet, except for then when we got up to the top and descended down to this unbeknownst location where Jeff had planted the dust collector where it wouldn't be visited by other hikers. We got to this little circle region and he was like, all right, it should be here somewhere. And we're like, okay. It took us maybe 10 minutes to find it, kind of digging around with our feet and hoping not to disturb the marbles once we did. But miracles, we found it, and took a while to uncover all the snow, but that was kind of fun. And this is the first one I was seeing in person. So I was like, wow, are they all going to be like this? How does he find them every time? But this was the only one that had these sort of conditions. And if you switch, Jeff, perfect. When there are snow, or when there is snow on top of the dust collectors, stoves and water, more water is needed to heat it up and melt the snow. We don't want to take any of that home. So it just helps to make things warmer. Yeah, definitely mittens were needed for part of this, but it was a fun first collection of the summer dust there. And then if you switch, Jeff, the next day, we drove west toward the Tusher Mountains. And these are also in Utah. And this day was beautiful. We were up there in t-shirts instead. So it was a gorgeous region to sit down and look, and Jeff was able to get out his drone and get some footage from above that you saw some of earlier from different locations. And definitely was simpler when, when we weren't digging through the snow to find it. And then if you switch again, the next day we drove further west into Nevada, and we were just outside of Great Basin National Park. I hadn't heard too much about that national park before being out there. Jeff had kind of framed it as one of the forgotten national parks just because it is kind of in the middle of nowhere. But one thing that I really enjoyed being out there for the fall was just how easy it was to camp. In Minnesota, we've got a ton of wonderful natural resource areas, and I've done a ton of camping there, but the idea of just having public roads and public spaces and you can kind of pull over wherever and set up camp was a little bit more foreign to me, and that was a lot of fun. So that's my tent right there, and it's actually just underneath Wheeler Peak in the distance. And right up there was where we were headed that next morning. I'm a little daunted. I hadn't really felt the sickness from the elevation, but it looked really far away when we were sleeping that night. But there's just a picture of the aspen trees because that was one of my favorite, all those golden colors. And if you switch it again, we did that hike up there, and it was another beautiful day. It kind of felt like we were in an airplane, just how far up we were. But this was another one of those situations where I'm just shocked that Jeff remembers where all of his dust collectors are, because we're walking up on the path with other, tourists and people hiking up to Wheeler Peak. And then all of a sudden we're at one curve and he goes, all right, now we go. And I was like, here, are you sure? And we just started going down and kind of descended into this basin that was resting underneath the peak there. And my sister just messaged me, I am wearing my Ely Outfitting Company quarter zip there. So representing Ely out there too. And then if you switch again, Perfect. This is the view from the top of Wheeler Peak, and under my feet way down there, there's a little glacier, which was fun to see. Jeff had told me to keep my eye out, so went up there and got to do summit the 13er, which I don't get to do out east. We've got more like 4,000 footers out here. So that was fun. And then if you click again, something I had to put in was the picture of Ely, Nevada. Jeff had told me we drive through, and I thought it was kind of funny because I've heard of it before, but of course it's so centralized to the Minnesota one. So it's fun to drive through. They're not as good in my opinion, but definitely the local hub for that very rural and just desolate region of Nevada. So I had sent that to my family. And then the last one that I did out in the field, we were in the Ruby Mountains, and this is also in eastern Nevada-ish, a little bit closer to central Nevada, but it also has a wilderness area there, which was, I didn't get to go in. We weren't there very long, but it was fun to camp. It was beautiful, and this one was also up on more of a ridge, not quite at the high point of that region, but pretty close, and some more beautiful fall colors, which was really a treat to see. And then after this, I was able to go and empty one in the city in Salt Lake, which was crazy to see. You know, it was sitting on the top of a university building and next to a bunch of construction sites, and it was really visible how much more dust was trapped in that collector as opposed to some of the ones that we've been seeing in the alpine zones. So this compilation of pictures is just to show you a little snippet of what happens when the dust comes back to Middlebury, and that's the majority of what I do with it. Those 5 days out there were fun, but the rest of the year is in Vermont typically. So they come back in those Nalgene bottles that you see in the middle, labeled 11A, 11B, 11C. There's 5 per dust collector. So the first thing we do is take those 5 Nalgenes and consolidate them into one small tube, like on the left there. So that happens with a lot of centrifuging, which is in the top right corner, and getting them, pouring them into one tiny thing. And from there, we're able to add hydrogen peroxide because we want to get rid of all the organic matter. We don't really care about whether there's algae or something else in it. We just want the mineral dust and water. So it sits for about a week to get rid of all of that stuff. And once we've burned off anything organic, we can sieve it. And that's what I'm doing in the top left. So dust, what we consider dust is under 63 microns. So we sieve it so that we have coarse dust and fine dust. And the fine dust is what we do all of the analyses on, because that's what we're really looking at, is that really small stuff. So after sieving it, we can run it through that Hariba machine, which is on the bottom left. This essentially runs it through and shines a bunch of lasers at it, and then gives us a nice curve of what size grains are in each of the samples. So I'll show you a little bit of that after. And then we also weigh it to kind of look at the flux. That's what Jeff was talking about when he showed you that bubble graph. We want to see how much dust is coming in each location. And then I'll also get to this machine in the center bottom, but that's XRD. We look at mineralogical analysis with that. Perfect, you can switch, Jeff. And so this is, I'm just going to show you some preliminary results. I haven't gotten them all back yet, nor have I fully analyzed them. But if we go back to my main question of looking at whether or not each of these dust collectors show distinct data, this means I'm trying to collect all the properties I can from each of these collectors, and using the properties, I can kind of fingerprint that. Not only comparing them to each other, but also within the region, there are sources, known sources of dust that have some fingerprints that are publicly available. So I can compare them and see, actually this has a lot of this one component. So it's probably coming from, this one desert in this area, that sort of thing. So all of this data that I'm showing you is going toward that overall goal. So for the first, the grain size, this is cool. This shows what the 6 dust collectors show. 11, 12, and 15 are the 3 on the right there, that kind of consolidated right hump. And those are all from Nevada, which is pretty cool to show that, maybe those 3 dust collectors in Nevada are receiving a lot of the same stuff. And then the others, it doesn't quite move linearly. For 13 is not the furthest east, which you might suspect if it's that opposite from the most western ones. But it's interesting to see the differences and look at what that might mean. So essentially, bigger grain sizes just by a little bit toward the west is what we see so far with that. And then if you switch it, this is showing the dust flux. So basically the same thing he showed you in that map, but on a graph instead. And this is on a logarithmic scale on the y-axis. So just notice that they are very different. And this is also identifying number 10 is the one in the city, and that one has by far the most accumulation of dust. And the ones I'm focusing on are 11 through 16. So if you switch one more time, Jeff, this will show 11 through 16 on a scale that makes a little bit more sense. So we don't have winter collections from 14, 15, and 16, and that's a combination of a fire. So Jeff couldn't get in to collect number 14 in June. And then one of them, we could only collect once that year. Another one had to be moved partway through the year. So that's what's going on there. But you can see that the winter collection is definitely smaller, but not by as much as you might think, I guess, in terms of snow covering it the whole time. But for me, it's interesting to see that 16 and 11 have the most accumulation. And 16 is the one in Idaho, and 11 is one of them in Nevada. So they're kind of close by geographically, but not like as close as 15 and 11 are, which is interesting to think about what sort of wind patterns is making that accumulation different. And then if you switch again, this fuzzy chart, that big machine that I showed you earlier, X-ray diffractor, this is looking at the mineralogical components of each of these samples. So you run it through this machine, it comes out showing us these peaks, and these peaks give us different indication of minerals. So for example, that first one, that's showing that there's illite and kaolinite, and the biggest peak is quartz because all of these have a lot of quartz content. And then there's elbite also. So this is something that I use to determine what's in each of them. And for example, the light blue one there, that's number 14, way out on the left, it's got that big spike where nothing else does. And that's like a smectite clay that we're still trying to determine what it is. So it's interesting just to see like what might be there that's not in the other samples. So what might be around the La Salles near Moab, Utah, that's showing that spike that we don't see anywhere else. And then if you switch again, oh, the other exciting thing is that over my February break, Jeff, I don't think he mentioned this, but maybe, yeah, he did. But he did his PhD at Madison. So he's got some connections with the lab there, and I was able to go to Madison into this clean lab to do some strontium isotope data collection. So I wasn't able to do it the whole time, but they finished it for me. And I just got those results back a couple days ago. So not totally analyzed yet, but this is cool because using the 87, 86 isotopes of strontium, 87 is radiogenic. So in determining, the ratios of those, you can kind of, this is just a very specific fingerprint that you can take from different sources and kind of identify where dust might be coming from. And then one last slide is just the view that I have here from my science hall at Middlebury in Vermont. And just to say that it's very much ongoing and it's exciting. And I am doing the geochem analysis this week. That's on a different machine that has been broken for a little while, but back up and running. And so continuing to get this in, and hopefully by the end of my time at Middlebury, of course, just a blip in Jeff's research, I can help identify, where some of this is coming from and some of the harmful components where we might be able to mitigate it, whether it be a certain mine out there that's kicking up a lot of a certain element that is very much harmful to the soil, or to humans breathing it in, that sort of thing. But it's been exciting to learn about and fun to work with Jeff too, and in his broader project. So thank you guys for listening and coming to watch.
Awesome, Elsa. Thank you, Lacey. That's our presentation. So if you want to help moderate, or we can just follow in the chat. If anyone has questions, Elsa and I would love to try to answer them for you. I'll turn off the share so you can see everybody.
Great. I think there's a question or two in the chat, Jeff, if you can see that too.
Yeah, I just called the chat up. So Lacey did ask one earlier on about why is fine dust better to analyze than coarse dust? What do you think, Elsa?
Well, fine dust travels a lot better. So what coarse dust would probably be is a lot of pickup from soils or other immediate area in each of these collectors' locations, whereas the fine dust is really getting at the stuff that moves up with the wind and is suspended for long periods of time before it might be deposited somewhere.
Yeah, if you think of the video that I showed at the very beginning with dust, traveling all around the world, it's only the small stuff that goes a really long distance. And, in this project or in Elsa's project, we're not too interested in the stuff that only blows a couple of yards or a couple of miles and lands in the collector. We want the stuff that came from far away. And a good way to isolate that is to just focus on the finer grain material. Barb, you have a question about the fires. Yeah, I didn't show any pictures of this, but boy, doing field work in this part of the world in the last couple of summers and last couple of falls, you knew that things were burning in California and Nevada, and I know that there were fires up near you guys as well. So this smoke in the air is not an unfamiliar thing. But as Elsa mentioned at the beginning of her section, we actually try to eliminate the organic matter more or less as one of the initial steps in our processing, which means if there was soot or ash or micro charcoal or something in the dust collector, we wouldn't really know it. I know that sounds like a little bit of a self-inflicted blind spot. It's because we're more interested in the mineral component, and we tend to focus on that. I'm certain that there's going to be ash in these collectors because there have been some fires that have been quite close in the last few years, but we haven't been specifically looking for it. Glenn had a really similar question, looks like, about if the fires have affected the collection and analysis of dust. There are people that are certainly looking more at that. The deposition of charcoal on the landscape and charcoal landing in lakes, for instance, and how it gets into the sediment. So that's, even if that's not a big part of our project, it's definitely something which is a topic of study for sure.
Yeah, I can start on Jeff's question.
Sure.
You can hop in. But Jeff's question is, do you think this research will add any insights to climate change mitigation? And on a broad level, yes. On a nitty gritty, not so much. But Professor Jeff's big project, there's a lot of Jeffs around, but is highlighting a lot of the changes that climate change is bringing. So, Salt Lake is drying up, and the playa there is creating a lot more dust than they've ever seen out there near Salt Lake. And has a ton of implications in terms of human health with what we're breathing in terms of industries like skiing. If, this dust is affecting precipitation rates and also affecting snow cover, and when it melts, that's going to impact a ton of people, both recreationally and in terms of jobs. And also, one of the things that I've been interested in working on this project is what's in the dust and what might be harmful. So there's a lot of mining projects and other things out west that might be introducing different elements that aren't typically seen in these natural environments, and how them landing in these areas, like Jeff looks at a lot of the soil components and stuff, what that's doing to those fragile environments, and also what that's doing to our lungs. So I'm not getting as much into that, but those are kind of the big question pictures that his bigger project is addressing. So that's how I see it. But
yeah, it's a great answer. This project, Dust Squared project, has kind of projects within projects within projects. It's like the Russian doll cliche, and the Great Salt Lake is a great microcosm really for our project, in the sense that the source of the dusts, the area around the Salt Lake, the reason for the dust, the shrinking Salt Lake, and the locations that are impacted by that dust, like Salt Lake City, are all right next to one another. So it's easy to wrap the head around. But again, think of the video that showed that dust travels a long, long way. And so we could easily be getting dust in Elsa's collectors that is from hundreds of miles away somewhere else in the Southwest, or even from Asia or another part around the world. So climate plays a huge role in controlling the amount of dust which is available. But when you consider the scope of the project, it's difficult to say that we'll have one particular recommendation that'll lead to a climate resolution. But certainly at the scale of things like the Great Salt Lake, I hope we can have some impact. Lacey has a great question here about, can we see cesium deposits from nuclear bomb tests from the 1960s? Yeah, in the Cold War, all of these nuclear bomb tests that were conducted in the atmosphere let off a whole bunch of exotic human-made elements that like aspects of cesium or isotopes of cesium that you can still find around the world today. We don't look for them specifically in the dust because we're not particularly interested in the age of the dust, right? If I collect it between October and June, then I know that it's dust that accumulated during that winter, rather than needing to resort to something more sophisticated to figure out how old it was. I'm sure we would see it though, to be honest. Certainly these Nevada sites were unfortunately quite close to some of the locations where there were nuclear tests, and probably the surface sediment which is being blown around by the wind still contains a little bit of that signal today. We haven't looked for it though. Let's see, Barb is asking about the city dust. The dust from the city location was different. Where does city dust come from? And can you see city dust in more remote sites? Elsa, you haven't looked too much beyond just the amount of dust at the Salt Lake City location, right?
no, but I guess a little bit of this, from what I understand, is a lot of the dust in the city is coming from everyday events that happen, within a city, whether that be driving on pavement or construction sites, or burning fossil fuels, stuff like that. There's just such a higher concentration of activity in those regions, and activities that kick up a lot more particulates. So that's why it receives so much more. But I think that Jeff's sites in the UNAs, they are downwind of Salt Lake City, and you can see some of those same fingerprints from the city coming into those alpine environments up there.
Yeah, when you look at the chemistry of the dusts in northeastern Utah, for instance, it's got a lot of elements in it, a lot of things which are coming from human activity upwind in the city or at mining locations like Elsa mentioned. So, but when I introduced the overall idea behind the Big Dust Squared project and said that we didn't want to look at specific parts, but rather we want to look at the whole thing from start to finish, that's a good example of how we'll be able to study the city dust and how it relates to the non-city dust or the natural dust. Because people have studied urban dust for a long time, and people have studied dust in the mountains for a while as well, but very few projects, if any, have attempted to look and see how much of the dust in the mountains is coming from the city, or how does natural dust upwind of the mountains change as it moves through a big urban center like the area around Salt Lake City. So that'll be fun to see in the future. There's obviously more of that stuff. It's got different sources and different components, so we want to know more about it. Great question here about how high in the atmosphere the dust is moving and if those patterns are changing. This is the beauty again of having this big collaborative project, because I'm not an atmosphere person really at all, and yet I get to work alongside people who could answer this question at the drop of a hat. Most of the dust that we're looking at doesn't, in my understanding, go too high. If you think about how high you are in an airplane or something like that, that's about as high, several miles up. You get higher than that, the atmosphere kind of has like somewhat slightly impervious partitions, get into the stratosphere, for instance, if you've heard that term before, and dust coming off the ground is going to have a hard time getting that high. Something that gets thrown up by a volcano could go that high, but it's got a lot of momentum behind it. Something that's just blown up out of the desert is probably going to go a few miles up, if even that. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, the audience wants to know about your wildlife.
Oh, we could have had just a whole slideshow about wildlife. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's one of the great privileges of getting to work in these beautiful locations, is that you see on any given day amazing things. And high in those mountains, mountain goats, Dall sheep, bighorn sheep, elk, moose, little big marmots, little pikas, like all these critters that somehow make their living in these locations. And we drop by in the summer and maybe see them, and then they're there for the rest of the year. Golden eagles, just beautiful things. That I never tire of having those moments where you see something that you're in the right place at the right time, and you feel really fortunate to see it.
Yeah, my friend was out with Jeff in June, just helping him, and they saw a fish supply drop.
It's like a human wildlife convergence. Yeah, a lot of these high mountain lakes, they still stock them with trout that they drop in from small plains. So we were taking a break on a big hike alongside this lake, and this Cessna came in kind of low, and the students were like, "What is he doing?" And I was like, I know what he's doing. And he came right over us and right over the lake and opened the hatch and dumped 10,000 little baby trout into the lake. So students were staring at it like they couldn't believe their eyes. Sorry we didn't see that, Elsa. I don't think they stocked in October.
That's okay.
Have we exhausted your questions? I don't see any more in the chat.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lacey.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Super fun to come and talk about it.
Definitely. We're right on time. Elsa can get to class. You can get on with your afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for your attention and your great questions.